Thank the Gilfus Education Group in particular for offering this opportunity to spend some time talking about total cost of ownership and related subjects. Much of this will be introductory for you, I think, or a review, shall we say. And we'll take a look at a couple of agenda items here to start with. I want to talk a bit about the idea of total cost of ownership. What are the elements of it? What adds up to that total cost? A bit about an innovation case study based on the idea of design for affordability. We'll talk a bit about that. And then I want to spend a few minutes with you talking about some trends, specifically the trend towards software as a service or cloud computing, and then the concept of open source computing. So that's the message of the morning. The first question, of course, is what makes up this total cost of ownership? And I know you've taken a look at this before in various ways, but there are a number of elements that make that up. Payments to vendors, of course, that's the obvious one. Internal costs is pretty well known. Hidden costs, well, they're hidden, so what do we know about them, huh? And the last point that is very important has to do with return on investment. I wish I could spend time talking about that because that's where it all happens. The whole idea of how do we get our money back, essentially, as we invest in technology or invest in anything. You know, what is the value of this to my institution? Where am I going to get the payback from? If it's costing me money and doesn't give me a benefit, I'm not going to do that. But I'm not going to dwell on that because that is a subject for another day. So what does make up this payments to vendors? Well, the obvious ones. You've got planning and consulting, the software license, and so forth. One area, though, that is not so obvious is the matter of data conversion, especially in a large software system. You already have something in place, so you need to bring that data forward and convert it from the old to the new. It can be very costly, and sometimes suppliers are reluctant to give you a number. So that's one where payments to vendors is very important. The ongoing costs are similar. Some of the things there that are obvious, you know, training, software support, and whatnot in an ongoing environment. Because as soon as, you know, somebody comes in, a new person, you've got to get them trained, you've got to get them up to speed, and so forth. So those are pretty obvious kinds of costs. But one that isn't always so obvious is the whole matter of enhancements and changes, which can be extremely costly. We recently had an opportunity to talk to a college that needed some relatively minor improvements to an existing package, and the vendor said, well, this will be fine, we'll do it for $900,000. And oh, by the way, support on this enhancement will be $90,000 a year. So that can be an exceptionally large cost if you're not aware of it in the first place. So, but these are more or less obvious things, and I'm not going to dwell on them. The internal or soft costs are another matter. It's hard to put numbers on these. Sometimes the internal or the soft costs are non-incremental. Similarly, the savings can be non-incremental, if you will. So it's very difficult to do the accounting to figure that out. But a couple of the things that are within that category, things like employee time during implementation, things like conversion validation, some of those things that you may not always think about right off the bat. You say, oh, we're going to put in a new accounting system. Well, we're going to put in a new student system. We're going to put in a new, we're going to go to Moodle or whatever it is. And we need to think about all these things that are in the background. Sometimes the cost is not going to be specifically accountable, so to speak. Sometimes that cost is going to be what we sometimes refer to as that opportunity cost. If I do this, what else can I not do that may have a bigger impact or a different impact on the school? So it's a lot of soft thinking and a lot of soft costs, but very hard edge thinking to put that together. One of the other things here that comes up is this whole idea of programming for internal reporting and similar things like that, because the vendor package, whatever vendor package it may be, may not present information in the specific manner in which you need to have it. So that's a piece of that. The hidden costs. Now, how do we capture hidden costs if they're hidden? So my point here is just to give you some ideas, where to look under the rug to see if you can find some of these things. Sometimes in higher ed, systems will be cost-based on things like full-time equivalents. Sometimes they'll be cost-based on things like how big is the database, as the database grows. In both cases, institutions are essentially penalized for success. And as business managers, I would suggest that that's a good place to look for some way to beat up the vendor, quite frankly, because that really is in our view at least, an inappropriate means of figuring out vendor fees. And then of course there's the third point, which is just because. And why is the price going up? Well, because inflation, or well, because. So in other words, things to watch out for. Also in the hidden costs, one-off modifications. One-off modifications say, for your college, I'm going to develop this piece of software. I may develop the same piece of software for 9 other schools, almost identical, but I'm going to charge you again for it. So a good thing to watch out for in terms of one-off modifications. It also increases your support costs exponentially when you end up with these one-offs, because somebody's got to support them. So every change you make, somebody's got to test. Every change you make, somebody's got to go back and validate that this is working the way it's supposed to work. And oh, by the way, all the things that surround it are similarly working the way they're supposed to work. So it's not a small matter by any means. A question of what does it take for my staff to support this product, to implement things like new updates or what have you. Sometimes that can be an exceptional cost, and I would just bring that to your attention. I know you're not technologists, you're business managers. Your CIO needs to think about that, and you need to perhaps question the CIO about some of these things yourself. And this is a real important thing too, the idea of that next release. Do I have to scrap what I have now? Do I have to pay vendor ABC again because they have updated their software and changed it? And oh, by the way, the old version is going to go out of maintenance in 2 years. I mean, where am I with that? And as a business leader, can be a very shocking number to see coming at you. It also opens the door to a new system, which isn't always a bad idea, but the cost, it can be very high. So I'd like to switch gears now and talk about a concept that we have called design for affordability. We're from the Detroit area, so much of our thinking is kind of motivated by manufacturing. Well, in manufacturing, there is a term in engineering called design for manufacturability. And that says, if I design, I design this, for example. It's a great design, it's wonderful, it's attractive. What does it cost to make it? What does it cost to keep this item going? In the case of a car, maybe what does it cost to keep that car on the road? What does it cost for the tooling? So that's design for manufacturability. So we've grabbed that and said, what about the idea of design for affordability? What can a vendor bring to the party in terms of their design that is of value to you as the user or the buyer? Again, the questions have to do, in this case, with cost. So there are lots of things that you can do. You can enforce standards, which reduces costs. You can make the product database-centric, reduces costs. You can do things like use a common tool set. You can do lots of those things in the very early design phase of the product. So how do you figure this out? How do you understand this? Much of it needs to be done by IT staff or frankly, by calling around and talking to other customers who use the software already. Number of things that go with that, things like rules and variables. What happens if I have to call a programmer every time I want to change my college catalog? What if I change from allowing only a straight grade to allowing a plus or minus grade, A minus, A plus? What if I do something else like that? Do I have to call a programmer and pay them big bucks to change that? Or can I go into a little table and change that business rule? What if I change my billing? How I manage that? Do I have to call a programmer, or do I simply change a rule? Extremely important matter of cost in terms of affordability and that design in Do I do table-based stuff, or do I have to do hard code to redo this all the time? Things like modular structures. Can I only buy what I need? Do I have to buy the whole thing? So that's pretty much the modular concept. And open-ended design says, what does it take to make changes? Do I have to tear this apart? Do I have to open up all the envelopes, to just change one thing? Or is it designed from scratch to allow me to add to it, to redesign, to rebuild, and do those kinds of things? So again, it's somewhat of a technical concept, and maybe something that you would need to talk to IT people about. But in terms of cost, it really does change the whole picture. This last one is one that is a little unusual, and that's the idea of a single code set. That says that all of the users who have this product use exactly the same product. There's no changes, there's no one-offs. Remember we talked about one-offs at the beginning? Same idea. But if I have a single code set and I run my modifications via rules and variables, then I can do this, and my cost of maintenance should drop exponentially, because I'm not maintaining 50 or 60 or 100 or some number of individual instances of the software. Extremely important in terms of looking at that total cost of ownership issue. We know that the maintenance of many products is much higher, especially over its lifetime, than buying the product itself. Also in that area of design for affordability is the functional delivery concepts. So do I deliver a system that's out of the box and working, or do I deliver you a really nice toolkit, so you can build your own? Costs either way. Which is the more affordable? Which is the better approach to take? Do I buy a toolkit? Do I buy a product in the box? A lot of trade-offs to decide that. Things like the web presentation, web connection kind of stuff. Again, technical things has a big impact on overall cost, because you're using an established standard. You're using something that's basically free, rather than doing something which is an internal software for networking or something along those lines. User maintenance, we talked about that. Workflows that are designed into the product are another essential. To be able to do things functionally. In the higher education world, there's a really good example. If a student drops a class, what does this do for their financial aid? Is there a workflow that flows from Johnny drops a class to, oh, by the way, financial aid just dropped a bundle? Is there some way to track that in an automated fashion, or does somebody have to take a sticky note and send it to financial aid to cover that? So those workflows are really, really important. Lastly, what I'll talk about is the idea of access to your data. It may surprise you, but there are many application products out there, especially some which may be in the SaaS world, where the ability to get at your data is really pretty restricted. At least it's very difficult, if not restricted. So that's a really important question to ask. Implementation to control costs. If you look at a proposal for ERP software or something along those lines, it is not uncommon that the cost of the software is 25 to 30% of the implementation, and the rest is labor. The rest is implementation. In the case of software as a service, in most cases, the cost of the software, as expressed in a proposal, is zero. So it's all seen as services and labor. So if we look at that from a total cost of ownership basis, we really have to look at that implementation package with great care. Is the vendor offering you a standardized, well thought out, step-by-step process, or is it, we're consultants, we'll get there and we'll get this figured out? Is there benefit to either one? Sure there is, but which one protects you against some pretty substantial costs in the future? I guess it boils down to, is this a matter of a consulting company, or is this the matter of a software implementation company? Things like an in-depth business analysis to start the process off. How many weeks does the vendor anticipate spending with you before anything even happens, in order that they can understand your business, understand your school, understand your needs, do the gap analysis. Here's where we are, here's where we've got to be, how do we get from one to the other? Extremely important aspects of implementation, because it controls the cost. Also in that area, to look out for things like data conversion pricing. Somebody who knows what they're doing should be able to look at your data with some care and tell you very carefully and stick with that price as to what that conversion is going to cost. If somebody says, well, you know, we charge $125 an hour, and when we get into it, we'll figure it out. Well, that's just writing a blank check. You know, here's your here's what we're doing. You get into it. Oh well, we're a little short. You know, so there's another $10,000 coming your way. I know that asking for fixed price implementation services might shock some of your suppliers, but I would absolutely insist on that. This is the price of implementation. If we change the scope, yes indeed, we'll come back and talk about it. But according to this contract, this set of T's and C's, that's the price. So you guys deliver. I know I'm a little tough on that, but I've been doing this for, oh my goodness, I've been doing this for 33 years. So I've seen some pretty unusual circumstances where the costs have risen out of sight because people didn't, you know, nail that down really tight. So I would ask you to think about that, and sometimes you may even have to, you know, tell a supplier or tell a colleague, we're not doing that, because we can't get our costs under control to really do what we've said we're going to do, the way we said we're going to do it. And that brings us to the whole matter of the T's and C's, the terms and conditions of the contract. And as business managers, that is your world. I mean, you live in the world of contract administration. A 5-year and no less fixed support agreement is, in my opinion, essential, with capped increases thereafter. Even if, you know, depending on your negotiation skills, the way to really do that is to say, you, Mr. Vendor, get to assure us that this will be our price for 5 years or 7 years, but I, the user, will call those option years. So I may or may not invoke those options. So again, depending on your negotiation skill and where you are in terms of that vendor, not a bad approach to take. In fact, that's the way the federal government does it. It's take it or leave it. Here's the price, here are the options. You know, you want to do business with us? Here you are. You don't want to do business with us? But nice knowing you. So that kind of stuff is real important. Similarly, labor rates. And the third point there is, again, I want to reiterate the concept of upgrades versus updates. Subtle difference. Updates are the kind of thing that's a bug fix. You know, it's a new financial aid rule, something like that, and it's in the whole run-of-the-mill of things that have to happen. Upgrades may very well be a total rip-out because the software is a different version. So you're literally, in many cases, having to take the existing data that you already have used in this vendor system and make a conversion from system A to system B, just as you would if you were changing vendors. So a very important component of that, to make sure that in your maintenance there is some maintenance contract, there is a provision that defines, first of all, what is an upgrade and what is an update. You know, capital letters, you know, capital U for update, capital U for upgrade. So when you do your declarations at the beginning of the contract, that's one of your definitions. So nobody's coming back and saying, well, that's not covered under your maintenance. That's an upgrade. It may take some being tough to do that. Does the software require a specific level of technical support? This can be a very costly proposition. Similarly, it can be a negotiating point to have the vendor say, well, I will come and install that new version of Oracle. It's part of your maintenance. I will come and take care of this detail, rather than have you take that hidden cost to accomplish that. And I can't ever estimate the importance of references, especially in the area of maintenance. You know, you ask the vendor for references, and you know what you do. You take those references and you say, well, I'm going to call those references, but I'm also going to say, well, who else is using this software? Can you tell me some other people that the vendor didn't tell me about? So make that kind of that 6 degrees of separation thing, you know, to get out there into the world to find out, you know, who isn't the vendor telling me about? What are the ones that are not quite so happy with this, you know, who haven't had quite that wonderful experience? So especially in the area of support, because it's quite subjective and it will change from time to time. So I think it's important to make sure that that's thoroughly vetted in terms of getting those kinds of answers. Just to kind of summarize, the initial product design does yield cost benefits or not. The implementation costs more than the product, so get it right. And lastly, maintenance can crush you. So those are my 3 golden nuggets for software we're buying. I'd like to shift emphasis just a little bit and talk about open source and talk about SaaS, because these are major activities, these are major trends that are happening in higher education today. Open source is very important. Now, do you know what open source is, generally speaking? Okay, so you do. But one of my associates, shall we say, is Colonel Joe Adams. He's just retired recently from the Army. If you've been in the military consulting business at all, or military systems business, you've run into Joe Adams, because he is the expert in terms of data security for the Army. He ran data security in all of Europe. He was a professor at West Point, fabulous guy. But he said, it's free puppies, not free beer, when you start talking about open source. Just think about that for a couple seconds. So what is this high cost of free? Well, first of all, quick definition. Open source is programming code that is shared, usually without any charge, usually by a consortium. That's a pretty quick definition of it. So you get it for nothing until you start to implement it. There's a trend. Now there was a meeting here at this conference about Sakai today. I know there was one about Koali. There was a Koali group that came by. You're all familiar with Moodle. You're familiar with those kind of things. From operating systems, you're familiar with Unix, which is open source. You're familiar with Linux, which is open source. Those kind of things are very familiar to us. In some cases, it works great. It really, really, really does. In some cases, not so good. Why? Because you're on your own. You're on your own for implementing the software, because there's no vendor to tap on the shoulder and say, come on back over here, this didn't work so great. You're going to train yourselves, because there is no training, or very little, and certainly no modified training for your institution. You will support yourselves. If the thing breaks, who's on the hook? There is no vendor. There may be a consortium, but there is no vendor, so you're on the hook to take care of that yourself. And you will, as a part of that consortium, be expected to do additions and contributions. And who pays for that? You do. So how do you get around that if you like the open source software? Well, you can hire a consulting firm, and they'll do all this kind of stuff. So you get to pay the fee. Or you may look at a commercial company which has embraced this, and you essentially buy the open source software. You're really buying their implementation of it, their services package. Good examples of that in the Moodle world. You know, Moodle Rooms. There was Moodle, then there was Moodle Rooms, and then there was Moodle Rooms bought by Blackboard. So the continuum is pretty clear. Same thing happened with Unix. Open source, great, and then suddenly you've got HP's got their own Unix, and IBM's got their own Unix, and then comes Linux, and then comes Apple, and it becomes a really pretty interesting proposition. But my point, though, is that free is not free. So it's easy to succumb to the idea that we will simply use open source and we won't pay a vendor for this. You won't until later. And then you will, or you'll end up with some staffing that you didn't expect to have, or you'll end up with opportunity costs where things that you thought you were going to do, you're not doing because you're supporting somebody else's open source software. The last piece here that I wanted to talk just briefly about is the idea of software as a service. You may know it as cloud computing. It's an old idea. It's been around since the 60s. 70s, we used to call it things like shared computing. We used to call it GE. They had a brand name, whereas General Electric had this shared computing thing. It was exactly the same idea, but without the fine technology that we have 40 years later. It basically says that we are going to use a software product, we're not going to buy it. Somebody's got to pay for that, of course, and it's a matter of doing that really down deep cost analysis before you slip into that world. In our company's case, for example, we do both. We offer both a SaaS environment and we offer on-campus licensing, and the trends kind of go back and forth. Which is better? One of the things that reaches into that subject is your ability to calculate the incremental cost of a new software package from a technical and support point of view. If you're a big shop, you're a big university, you've got a server room, a couple more servers isn't going to make any difference. The incremental cost is zero. You're a smaller college, oh my goodness, now we're going to put new servers in, we got to upgrade infrastructure, we got to put in new fire suppression, we've got to do this, we got to do that, we've got to do the other thing. Very likely the SaaS model is the way to do it because you're avoiding all that incremental cost. But no incremental cost, really, where are you with software as a service if you're not really saving anything? Considering that there are downsides to it. So should SaaS be part of an institutional plan? If you're going to really review the whole matter of mission and say, is one of our missions here at XYZ University to be a fine IT shop, or are we educating students? Now maybe that would make a difference too in terms of where is our strength and what do we do the best. Will it reduce incremental costs? If you do reduce your cost, can you really lay somebody off? If you reduce your cost by half a person, how do you figure that out? What do I do with this half a person? Maybe you can, maybe you can't. And lastly, related to one of my earlier points, does the software as a service vendor have an enforceable position regarding ownership and access to your data? Again, a contractual matter for your lawyers to look at, but it cannot be overestimated as to the value of that simple point. There is some software that I know of where it is nigh on to impossible for the users to grab that without the vendor's involvement. And of course, write me a check to accomplish that. This is my half hour. I thank all of you. We hit the half hour on the button. I want to once again thank Gilfus for their kindness in offering us this opportunity to talk.